we'll start the traditional way, which is to have each of you introduce yourselves with a brief bio. How about we go in the order that you joined? Ms. McLeod-Skinner.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'm a natural resource attorney and organizational development consultant, serve on the Jefferson County Education Service District Board, and was appointed by the governor to serve on OWEB, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And my wife and I live in Central Oregon. The times we're in require a different type of leadership that's responsive and adaptable, understands crisis, has experience managing through crisis, and leaders who stand up for democracy and strong Oregon values and community building. So my focus is protecting our democracy, and that means not just our election systems, but also from the toxic culture that we've seen that's developed in the Capitol. Also ensuring accountable government. I've got extensive experience, executive management experience in the government and nonprofit sectors, including in audits from all perspectives, being audited as frontline staff, being audited as a manager, also in part of the conducting and oversight of audits, and also safeguarding our natural resources. And this is a huge issue for our economy, and especially our ag economy statewide. Come from humble roots. I was a single mom. She had 2 kids, and she'd get up early to drive a school bus, teach all day, and drive a school bus home. When I was 9, she took a teaching job in Tanzania. So part of my childhood was spent on the other side of the globe, seeing both how big and how small our world is. But we returned to the States, moved to Southern Oregon. So I'm a proud Ashland High graduate. From there, went on to get a degree in engineering. Also in engineering from RPI, followed my dad's footsteps, and then in city and regional planning from Cornell. At that point, I didn't take the corporate route, but wanted to engage in public service. Because I'd come out at a young age, came out and kind of had experience with an unlevel playing field and limited access since an early age because of that in the mid 80s. But the military was not an option, but I wanted to serve, and the war in Bosnia had just ended. So I ended up working for the International Rescue Committee, managing multi-million-dollar reconstruction projects in Bosnia, then in Kosovo. When I returned to the States, the IRC asked me to run their refugee resettlement office in the Bay Area. So I like to say I was Oregon's revenge for a while, going back to California. But managed providing citizenship services, and so working with very diverse communities. Also served as a city planner, worked in organizational development for a city that is award-winning for its organizational development, and also as a regional planner. Served 8 years on the Santa Clara City Council while I was doing that. Returned home to Oregon, got a law degree, focused on natural resource law, water law, Indian law. And then clerked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on the Klamath Water case for LUBA, and then also worked as a city manager in Southern Oregon for my wife and I. Moved to Central Oregon, and many of you are familiar with my run against Greg Walden in 2018, where the real focus was bringing folks together to bridge the urban-rural divide and address issues that span the political spectrum. So I've got 9 years elected office experience in urban and rural areas, but the real focus of this job, of course, is its executive management. It's overseeing many different divisions. And so I've got experience in that area, and again, have experience relationships statewide, but experience bringing folks together and building bridges, not kind of exacerbating a toxic culture. So I'm really excited about this role because there's so much we can do to strengthen our democracy. There's all ideas we can do to both enhance the elections integrity. There's also some things that we've needed leadership in the legislature to do. I'd be an advocate for those, but in my role as Secretary of State, I'd be making sure that more voices are heard, more folks are brought into the political process. And that's for looking at some of the discrepancies in demographics and making sure that more folks get access. On audits, accountable government is really important to me because I think that's how we build public trust.
Let's stop now. We'll talk about your priorities for the job in a moment. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Because of the format, I'm going to ask my colleagues if they have any follow-up questions after each presentation, if that works. Anyone? All right. Let's move on to Senator Fagan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning. And good morning to Mark, both Marks, and Aaron and Nigel and Jamie. In October of 2008, I was standing in line at a Starbucks, and in walks this tall, kind of lanky, kind of 14, 15-year-old kid. And as soon as I saw him, I was immediately starstruck and kind of blown away that I was near this person. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, that guy's on TV. He's running for office. That's Brent Barton. And for those of you who don't know Brent or haven't served with Brent, he was a former state legislator, real baby face, but he was running in 2008. And I remember, this is not 20 years ago. This is, almost a little over a decade ago, that just being in the same line with him at Starbucks felt like, wow, I'm suddenly close to this source of power, because my whole life growing up in Oregon, the people who made decisions over my life and my family's life felt so far away. I grew up in Dufur and the Dalles. I know that I've talked with Willamette Week many times about my story. My mom battled meth and heroin addiction in Portland and was homeless, kind of in and out of our lives. My dad was a single parent. I have two older brothers, and he raised us in Eastern Oregon. And I don't often talk about the fact that he also struggled to put food on the table. We were homeless for a period of time right before I started kindergarten. Although I didn't know we were homeless, my dad took us on a camping trip out in John Day, Oregon, that lasted for about 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And I learned later as an adult that we'd actually been homeless at that time, but my dad didn't want us to know. The reason we even had food on the table a lot of the time was because neighbors or folks in our church would come and, provide food for us. And so grew up feeling, I remember when I was about 10 years old, Barbara Roberts got elected governor of Oregon. I remember learning about it at Dufur Elementary School and coming home that day and feeling both excited that someone like me, that a woman had been elected governor, but also, the fact that that whole power structure felt not even miles away, it felt planets away from me. And so I ended up, going into law. So I went to law school at Willamette and Lewis and Clark. I'm a civil rights attorney. But when I finally got the opportunity myself to run for office, in part from after seeing Brent Barton and Jefferson Smith and kind of a young group of men run for office in 2008, I remember thinking, I thought I would always want to run for office, but it always felt like something I would do way down the road when I was in my 50s or 60s, not something I ever expected to do young. And then I saw these young men do it. And so I literally got on Google and Googled, how do you run for office? And I found a book that was out of print, and I ordered it, called A Woman Runs. And it turns out that the woman who wrote that book, I did not realize at the time that I bought it, was Jewel Lansing, who is kind of an icon of Oregon politics here, was the first woman to run for statewide office in Oregon. She ran for treasurer. And I read that book, I looked her up and found Emerge Oregon and ended up running for office. And I remember a lot of people that served in Emerge with me laughed because I asked just the craziest questions. I had never campaigned for everybody. I had no idea that canvassing, I thought running for office was like holding a sign on the street and saying vote for me. I had no idea kind of the structure that went into running for office. So I did the Emerge Oregon program, and in 2011 got the opportunity to run for school board in David Douglas and took on a 25-year incumbent to join the David Douglas School Board. And from there, I ran against an incumbent to win a seat in the Oregon House. 2 months after having my first baby, I won that seat, won re-election in 2014, didn't run again in 16 because I wanted to have another baby, and then ran in 2018 and defeated an incumbent Democrat. So I've run for office, my 5th time running for office in Oregon, and the 4 other times that I've run, I've never lost, and 3 times I've defeated incumbents. But while I've worked on issues facing working people and vulnerable people and oppressed communities, because of my background, my other big focus has been to know that other Oregonians out there who maybe see me in line at Starbucks don't have that feeling that I am so far away. So one thing I've tried to do in my whole legislative service is lead with my ordinariness and my vulnerability and my humanity. I've tried to break down barriers. We were the first legislator to do a teletown hall. This was back in 2013, 2014. And I remember folks telling me, wow, I never get to go to these things because I have kids. I'm attending your town hall from the stands of my daughter's volleyball game. And so we started a podcast. One of the most popular episodes was called How a Bill Becomes Law in Oregon with my kindergartner, where I sit down with my then 6-year-old and describe how a bill becomes law in Oregon. And so we've done all of these things to make sure that other people out there, whether they live in Dufur or Grants Pass or Klamath Falls or Portland, don't feel that the source of power over their lives is far away. They see someone like me that they can relate to. And I think that's something that we can bring to the Secretary of State's office, whose primary job is to restore faith in our democratic institutions in Oregon.
Thank you. Same questions for my colleagues. Any follow-ups at this time? All right. Senator Haas, thanks for joining us.
Can't hear.
Hey, Mark, check
Senator,
your
I
mute.
believe you're on mute at the moment.
You're not on mute. Can you, it doesn't look like you're on mute, but we can't hear you.
Is someone texting him?
I'll text him.
You can probably hear us. I just don't think we can hear him.
Yeah. Oh, there's
Well,
mute.
this is our first one of these, and we knew they would come with some excitement.
Sorry, this is a lesson. I'm going to have everyone test their mics before we start.
You could call in. There was a call-in number on the...
Yeah, that was about what I was going to say. Do you want to, Senator Haas, if you can hear me, do you want to try, you could try again, or you could also call in to the call-in number that was sent as part of this. Do you want me to forward that to you? Still can't hear you.
Hey, Mark, we can't hear you, so there is a call-in number.
Nigel, can you text him the call-in number?
Yeah. Marcus texted me that he's trying to sign on again. I'm going to get the call-in number.
Okay.
You could put on a puppet show in the meantime, Rachel. I see your puppet man behind you.
That was the one thing that I didn't remove from the background. There was a stack of toys behind me. I'm in my basement.
Nice.
All right. Okay, you are currently on mute, Senator Haas. You want to try unmuting? Oh, there you are.
Hello.
Hello.
Got it.
You guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
We can. This is, it takes me back to PTSD to my Channel 2 days. Technical difficulties.
Well, please go ahead and tell us why you're running for this seat.
Yeah, my name is Cass. I'm in the state senate.
I think I know
all of you.
All right,
and it's got no.
I'm going to pause you. It seems like can you mute your phone for a second and see if the video is working? Because now we're getting an echo, or at least I am.
Okay, how's this?
Yes, you're there. I think you can hang up your telephone.
Okay. I'm nervous about doing that because I think this laptop is going to fire, but go.
No, I think you're fine. You're good to go.
We've got you on video now, Mark.
No, his only audio is the phone.
Oh.
No.
Call us back. Oh man, this is unfair. Just give him the endorsement.
I've done enough of these with Mark. I can do his intro if you want for him.
We probably all do
he
better
did
intros.
Can you call back?
He served for many years. He's a journalist. His wife does amazing work with the school district.
Nigel, you texting him?
Yeah, I've just texted him, asking him to call again.
Sorry, that was a bad idea.
So what he needs to do is keep his video on and mute his mute it, and then talk into his phone. So someone needs to clearly instruct him on that, or we'll be doing this all day.
Yep.
All right, I'm texting him that now.
You guys, after this call, we can do a mini audit on the process just to see what are those opportunities for improvement.
Oh no, please no.
Audits can be good things.
I think we sense where the problem might be. I think we're seeing what could potentially be our shortfall here.
These are learning opportunities. Just think how great the next few endorsement sessions are going to go.
Yeah.
I can hardly wait.
That is a very positive way of looking at it, and I appreciate that. Another way of looking at it is think how many more times we're going to be doing this in the next 2 weeks.
Aaron, now the questions are for you. Do you have a Christmas story lady lamp in your window?
Yes.
Nice.
Yes, I do. That actually belongs to my partner, Kristen, who is a devotee of that movie and purchased that lamp 10 years ago.
Very nice.
Like that. And it has joined her here.
Nice.
Senator Hash, you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're running, please.
All right. I think most of you know me. I'm a former journalist in Portland. I'm a native Oregonian. And while I was a journalist in those years, mostly in the 90s, I observed a lot of things about my state. I left the state and came back. And when I came back and started reporting here, I saw that the values that I grew up with, values like taking care of each other, taking care of the land, taking care of schools, those values had been eroded. And so that's what originally got me into public service to begin with. My first term was in that recession year of 2001, 2002, and there's some eerie familiarities that I see today, almost 20 years later, from those times. And during that span, that 18-year span, I've learned a lot about how state government works, how government can help people, how government can respond to people. And I admit, I wasn't very good at first, and I had a learning curve, and we had 5 special sessions in 2002 to deal with this terrible recession we were in, and that was a function of the fact that every revenue forecast that came out was another $200–300 million down in the dumpers, and we had to come back with more cuts, usually more cuts, more tax plans. And but I've never forgotten those days, and I understand what pressure was like, what tough times were like, and I think that has sort of shaped who I am in state government and who I am today. And I really, if there's one thing that I learned during those years, is that when you respect others, they'll respect you. And so as I moved through the legislature and started chairing committees and got into the majority, I kept that MO, and that I think is responsible, really, as trite as it sounds, that is responsible for the successes that I've had in state government. The ones that we've talked about before, from the Oregon Promise, of course, full-day kindergarten, the Student Success Act, but there's one that's coming up now and coming into fore that we deal with a lot, and that's the creation of the Rainy Day Fund. And I have to tell you guys that of all the accomplishments that I've had over the years, or the things I've been associated with that I've been proud of, the Rainy Day Funds, there are 2, the Education Stability Fund and the Rainy Day Fund, received very little fanfare. But right now, when 2020 21 session rolls around, each of those funds will have close to $1 billion. And we'll have $1 billion in our ending fund. That's $3 billion that the state has cash on hand to deal with this terrible crisis that we're in now. And I know that when we have our revenue forecast next month, it's going to show we will need every penny of that. And that won't be enough to cover the state's needs over the next couple of years. But that will certainly be a cushion that we didn't have the luxury of in 2002, or for that matter, in 2009. And I've always said if we can't reform our tax code, the next best thing is to have these rainy day funds. And I think that's an example of what governance is all about. You know, there's nothing glamorous about a rainy day fund or saving money, but it's necessary. It's just one of those good government things that you have to do. And I think in my government experience, I've learned those kinds of things, that this isn't about giving speeches or shaking hands with the governor or getting your picture in the news. It's about those non-glamorous, day in, day out, nitty-gritty things that you eventually break through. And occasionally you can pass a transformational bill when you work together, like the Student Success Act last year, or like the Free Community College bill a few years ago, because you've been there for a while and you've established those relationships. People trust you and respect you if you trust them and respect them, even though they don't necessarily agree with you on the issues. And that's been my calling card in the legislature for a long time. And I think right now, I think this crisis that we're in emphasizes the need and puts an exclamation point on the fact that more than ever, we need people who are dependable and steady and people we can trust and have experience on the job.
Senator Hess, I didn't hear one thing in there. You said there are 2 rainy day funds, and was there a third fund you said that the state would be relying on?
There is the Education Stability Fund. There is the Rainy Day Fund. And then there's just the ending. It's not a fund. It's just money that wasn't spent in the last session.
I did not hear that phrasing. Thank you, technology. Any follow-ups from my colleagues at this point? Why don't we start the next question with you, Senator Haas. Is there a part of the Secretary of State job that you believe needs greater emphasis?
I think our technology needs to be upgraded to protect the database, the registered database. We're merely in compliance with federal law right now. And all of the technology experts, elections technology experts with firms that are based in Portland, surprisingly, are very nervous about it. And I think in this day and age of hacking, interfering, and meddling, that has to be job one. I'm surprised that so little is being paid attention to it now. And in all of my white papers and policy papers, I've called for an Office of Election Cybersecurity to deal with those technology needs and to deal with this issue of misinformation.
What do you think of the layoffs that have happened at the Secretary of State's office? Do you have a view on whether that the office is moving in the right direction in that regard?
No, I don't think they're moving in the right direction. I think they should be moving in the other direction. I was very surprised and troubled by it.
Thank you. Any follow-ups? All right, Senator.
Can I interrupt?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I want to take this in a slightly different direction. Ms. Fagan, could you explain to us why organized labor dislikes Mark so much?
I don't think organized labor dislikes Mark so much. I was endorsed by, I believe that he has the Teamsters endorsement, which is organized labor. I believe that, we all very much competed. We all went through an open democratic process with the labor unions in Oregon, and the vast majority of them have decided to endorse my campaign. Nobody has said to me because they didn't like my other colleagues who are running, but simply because they preferred me.
They clearly don't prefer him.
And why do you say that? What about it clearly don't prefer him?
Please. please, we're all adults here. We all know what's happened over the last 6 months. Please explain to us what the issue that organized labor has with Mark Haas.
I can't explain that. I can't speak for somebody else in an interview. What I can tell you is why that they support me, but I can't sit here and I'm not going to, first of all, I'm not going to dump on my colleague, and I'm not going to sit here and speak for organized for
So share with us then, what is the single issue that you think tilted organized labor in your favor?
Organized labor has been with me every single time I have run. When I ran,
but as it relates to the Secretary of State's race, why did organized labor decide to pile on and to support you with almost unlimited funds? What is the specific issue around which they are rallying?
They asked a variety of issues. It depends on which. I mean, I got endorsed by Cocoon.
Let me step in for a second. It's not just, this is a unique race in which they didn't just choose a candidate among those who are running. Representative Williamson dropped out, and they searched for a replacement candidate. So I think there is like a notable issue in this race that distinguishes it maybe from other races, even in which there's clearly at least a candidate backed by particularly public sector unions. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, what I'm referring to is I'd like to get some candor from these candidates about the dynamics of this state and organized labor and why Mark Haas is so objectionable. And frankly, what I'm hearing does not strike me as being very honest or candid about what are the issues. And I'd like to have a frank conversation about what's going on in the Democratic Party and why organized labor has aligned the way they have. And I frankly think Oregonians deserve an answer rather than what we're hearing.
Was it still a question to me?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're going to answer it.
Yeah, I mean, you and I don't know each other well, but being frank and candid is one of the things that I have had through my whole career. But you're asking me to speak for other people, and I can't do that. That's me being frank and candid with you. If you want me to tell you what questions they asked me in my endorsement interviews, I'm happy to do that. But I can't.
I want you to demonstrate to us your political intelligence and your willingness to be honest by telling us why it was that after organized labor forced Jennifer to leave the race, they came looking for another candidate because the candidates who were in the race were not acceptable. So I'd like some honest analysis from you.
I was not recruited in the sense that nobody came to me and promised me an endorsement. I'm just being, you want me to be honest with you. That's not how labor endorsements work. Everybody that's on this call, the candidates went through a process. We all got to go. If you go to the OEA PI convention or the OEA PAC convention, we all stood there in front of 300 educators and they democratically vote. So the idea that I came into this race promised some set of endorsements is not true. Now, did people expect that because of my record, I would have a good shot at winning labor? You're damn right they did. Because of my record, not because they didn't like somebody else, but because this is a big job. This is the second highest office in the state of Oregon. And so when I got into this race, did I do my homework and make sure that if I got in, I believed I'd have a coalition behind me that could win? I did. But that was because I went in knowing my record and knowing the history that I have. Labor endorsed me the first time in 2011 when I ran against an incumbent member of the school board. The school board, the Oregon School Association and the Oregon Education Association endorsed me then. And I have been a very strong supporter, even when it meant breaking with the Democratic Party. But I haven't only broken with the Democratic Party over labor. I've also broken with the Democratic Party over other issues, like voting against Peter Courtney had nothing to do with labor. In fact, a lot of people in labor were pissed off at me when I did that. But I did it because I believed it was the right thing to do.
Jamie, do you want to try to answer that question?
I think many organizations that give endorsements have a specific focus in mind, and it's, I think that the role of Secretary of State calls for someone who's going to create a more be willing to look into all the issues that need to be looked into through the audit process. The way I was going to answer the question was to talk more about the audit process and our opportunity to do a deeper dive and daylight more issues.
Can you pause for 1 second? Sorry. I'm getting a lot of feedback. I don't know if other people are, but if you could put yourself on mute when you're not speaking, I think that would help. On my computer, it's Command D. I took myself off sound while telling you that, but on my computer, it's Command D. But if you would mute yourself while other people are talking, unless you're about to engage. Thanks. Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted us to be able to hear your answer.
Yeah. But I will say, candidly, organizations do have an agenda, and there are conversations that do happen in public, and there are conversations that happen in private. There are also organizations that have diametrically opposed stances that, in some cases, that in this race have endorsed one candidate, but some of the organizations literally have issues that have no overlap. And so it is that difference between what is typically talked about publicly and there are conversations that do take place behind the scenes. We all know that. So I think, as a candidate, I can say that I'm focused on a fair and equitable process with our elections, with our audits, making sure issues are daylighted. And that's, some organizations and voters are very excited about that approach. And there are some organizations that are less comfortable with that approach.
Mark, would you like to answer the question?
Yes, I think it's pretty clear, and I'm not sure why my good candidate opponents aren't just explaining this truthfully. It all has to do with the purge that I made in 2019, which is how I sort of lost support from the public sector unions. And I think that was very clear. I'm surprised my other opponents aren't making this case, because they certainly played it up when they went before these organizations, talking about how they deserve their endorsement because they did not make that vote that Mark Hass did. Well, I did it, and I went to the OEA convention. I looked them in the eye, and I said, here's why we had to do this. We wouldn't have had the student success without it. And I know that you're not going to support me because of that, but I told them the truth.
If I could jump in here. So the PERS vote that Mark is talking about is 2019. Did I vote against that PERS bill? You're right, I did. But I've had labor's endorsement in every race I've ever run in. In 2018, when I ran against Rob Monroe, it wasn't over a PERS vote. So to narrow it down to one single vote, there are labor unions, the building trades endorsed me. They don't have, PERS is not a big part of there. Even the AFL-CIO, a lot of their members are private sector unions. And so it is a bigger sense of, now if you want to talk about specifically OEA, yes, I talked about that, but that was not, I didn't go up there and say I voted against PERS, vote for me, mic drop, I'm out. I went up there and gave my entire story, and my entire history was standing with working people and marginalized people in Oregon. So I actually think it's disingenuous to narrow it down to one vote and say, oh, that's why. I have been with working people in this state throughout my career, and they've been with me in every campaign, not because of one vote that took place in 2019, but because of every vote that I've taken since I've been in service in 2011. So I actually think it's disingenuous to narrow it down to one vote and say that's the reason. That does a disservice to the working people across this state who took their job very seriously. The very people who we call heroes right now, who are on the front lines in grocery stores and building houses and in hospitals right now that we're calling heroes, to narrow down their very democratic, very open process to one vote, I think is a disservice to the working people in this state.
Well, just to jump in, it's not all the processes were open. I mean, there was an example of a conversation that was had. I'm not going to get into specifics on it, but a conversation that was had prior to me even going before a body where it was very clear the decision had been made. But look, I'm the only one in this race who actually has been a union member. I was a union member for 10 years. I negotiated for my environmental planners when management was trying to essentially downgrade our level of professionalism or our classification. But it is I think disingenuous to claim that there's not some expectation and discussions that happen behind closed doors with really any organization, but also with labor. So that's, that's the truth of the matter. And I've, in my 8 years on the Santa Clara City Council, I took some tough votes in situations that I thought were best for the community. And people weren't always happy with it, but you've got to stand by what you believe and take those tough votes. But it's not a Pollyannish world. I think especially with the folks that are on this call to just say that it's there are backroom discussions, and I think everyone knows that.
Right. So I'm arguing against a straw man here. I never suggested I didn't have any. I mean, we all have had private conversations. The people that voted, whether it was SEIU or OEA or AFSCME, the people who voted in those rooms were not the people I had any conversations with. The people who opened, we were standing there together, Ms. McLeod Skinner, at the OEA PAC convention. You and I, when we got the results, I had no idea what the results were going to be. I was as nervous as everybody else, and they presented the results on the PowerPoint, and it was a close call, and I won that endorsement from an open process of a bunch of educators voting in their caucuses. And so
there's also a bunch of people who showed up in the room that day that don't typically show up at the OEA convention. And I think it's naive to claim that there's not phone calls take place and some thumbs that go on the scale. I think that's disingenuous.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting for two other of my colleagues who have previously received labor endorsements in the past and didn't seem to have a problem when you were endorsed by OEA for your race against Greg Walden. It seemed that then it was fair, but suddenly it's not fair only the time that you don't get it. The reality is these were transparent democratic processes. And it's hard to not win endorsements. There's endorsements I've not won. There's endorsements that you guys have gotten that I haven't gotten. But to then say the one time I didn't get it, it was unfair, seems to say more about the candidate seeking the endorsement than about the process itself.
No, I would have answered the question the same anytime I've been asked about it, anytime I've been endorsed. That's just straightforward. But it was a very different dynamic and a very different race. And again, it's because of that experience that I know that folks who showed up in the room that day before the vote went through, that they didn't show up before. They didn't show up in 2018. And so it was a unique day, and a lot of people showed up and were but I do think that the OEA process was a stronger, more robust process than many of the others that we went through.
Let's continue this conversation in a slightly different vein. Why don't we start with you, Ms. McLeod Skinner? Who's your biggest contributor and why, and what do they want?
So I'm not taking corporate PAC money. I'm actually the only candidate who's never taken from opioid manufacturers. So my contributors are individuals, and they want good government, and that is something I've stood for my entire career. It's something I've been part of ethics committee. I've been through ethics training. I've taken the tough stance when ethical issues were brought to bear, and so the expectation on me is to do this role well, fairly to all Oregonians, bring back integrity, or not. I don't want to disrespect our current Secretary of State, but demand a level of integrity from this office, and create that expectation for everyone, regardless of party.
So is there a largest?
Which individual is the largest contributor, however?
I apologize. I can get that information to you, but I don't have that at my fingertips. I apologize. I can get that to you later. But it's probably it's a couple $1,000.
Senator Haas, same question to you. Who's your largest contributor? Why, and what do they want?
My largest contributor is a guy named Dick Roy. He and his wife have been running a nonprofit called Center for Earth Leadership. It's an environmental organization, and it's an absolutely fabulous organization. He's concerned about Oregon. He's just in the process of retiring from his nonprofit world, and he made a donation of $20,000 to my campaign because he cares about this state, and that's what he wants, is a better Oregon.
Does he have some kind of did I hear that right, that he has an environmental group? Is there some kind of environmental?
Yes.
agenda
Yes,
that intersects with the Secretary of State's office?
No, you can Google him up. It's called Center for Earth Leadership. It's strictly an environmental law. He has no agenda other than taking care of the land and the environment. And he and his wife, Jean Roy, have been co-directing this group for, 20 years now. He was a former lawyer in Portland and left to devote his life to helping the environment.
All right, Senator Fagan, same question to you. Who's your big contributor, and what do they want?
Yeah, I have my computer right here, so I could go on my OrStar. I don't know the exact. I'm assuming. I know that AFSCME gave me, I think, a $10,000 contribution. I know that there will be. I expect there will be other contributions coming, and so I think that's. I'm not trying to be dishonest. I just haven't looked at I don't kind of go on my OrStar daily. But I think, that if there's a different one, you can tell me. But as far as I know, the largest contribution I got, I think, was from AFSCME for $10,000. But if that's wrong, you can tell me. It's something my campaign manager looks at, not me, every day. And so what do they want? I went before them. We all went before them. Their biggest concern in the endorsement interview was about the recent Republican walkouts and how we actually restore faith in our democracy when people vote, they vote fairly. We don't have any questions about the security of our elections. We have paper ballots. We have automatic voter registration. And yet, even when the results are given, then when a certain, section of the political party that didn't win doesn't want to actually honor the result of the election and walks out, that was their big concern. And so what they want is a Secretary of State, unlike the one that we currently have right now, who has essentially been silent on the essential shutdown of our government, despite the fact that the job of Secretary of State, I think at the 35,000 foot level, is to restore faith in democracy, to make Oregonians, regardless of whether they always agree, know that their government is fair and working for them. And so that was the biggest issue when I went before AFSCME, which was one of the earlier, and I think their endorsement process was kind of that last weekend. If I remember correctly, I went down there the last weekend of February. And so it was right as these walkouts were happening. So that was their biggest concern at the time, was about the Republican walkouts.
And do you have an idea in mind of how the Secretary of State would, prevent shutdowns, or what are you talking about there?
Sure. So I think that the Secretary of State, when you look at Oregon, how we've moved into being elections leaders in the country, it's because we had secretaries of state who had electoral experience. When we, passed vote by mail, that was a Secretary of State who had experience as a legislator. And so all of the big ideas, some folks, I'm not suggesting people in this race, I just mean in the past, some folks see the Secretary of State as purely an agency head. But there are a lot of agency heads in Salem who serve underneath the governor. The Secretary of State is not just an agency head. She's actually a policymaker and has to have a vision for the office. And so all the big stuff that we've done in Oregon to make us a leader in election security has been because a Secretary of State has gone and built an agenda and then gotten that agenda passed through the legislature. And so I think with respect to walkouts, Oregonians would have to amend the Constitution to affect the constitutional quorum issue. But I think that there is space, and you guys have reported on these ballot measures that we're going to be attempting to put on the ballot. But obviously, it's very hard to do signature gathering in a stay home, stay safe environment. But I think that would be part of my agenda as the Secretary of State, as restoring faith in our democracy agenda, is to make sure that when folks do walk down and shut down the process, they don't get paid, and that if they do it they have a certain number of unexcused absences, they're not allowed to re-seek that job and run for re-election. And so I think that the statutory changes that were going to go on the ballot, but then obviously, the pandemic happened. I think those can be part of a legislative agenda for a Secretary of State. As legislators, we see that all the time. The governor, of course, is an executive, but she comes with a legislative agenda. The treasurer, the Department of Justice, Boley, those constitutional office holders in Oregon always have a legislative agenda, and yet they're able to use the bully pulpit of being a statewide leader to actually build that support, as opposed to just being one of 90 members of the legislature.
Senator Fagan, and another question for you. What area of state government deserves to be audited first, and why?
I might have answered this question differently 2 months ago, but I think that what we've seen right now is that we need our emergency preparedness audited immediately. because obviously this is not our last pandemic, but more importantly, we have the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake coming anytime in Oregon. And while we're getting a preview of how we do under a crisis in Oregon, there of course would be unique issues in an earthquake, like bridges going down, possible electrical grids going down, et cetera. So I think that we need a comprehensive audit of how did we do with respect to this pandemic? How do we do in our emergency preparedness? We're ready for the next one. So that wouldn't just be one government agency being audited. That would be multiple government agencies being audited. But if you're looking for one agency, I do think that we need to look at the Department of Corrections, which definitely ties into this pandemic. I think just this morning, the New York Times was talking about prisons being the next big places where there might be these outbreaks of coronavirus. But of course, we need to go well beyond that and to continue to make the case to Oregonians that right now have Measure 11 and other mandatory minimums in the Constitution, but through our auditing function, showing them the amount of money that we're spending in corrections that we have to spend under the Constitution, and that we can't use those funds for other upstream services, and really audit the Department of Corrections in a way to see what they're doing well. What are we doing well? Because I believe that audits don't have to be used just to beat frontline workers over the head, but they can be used to elevate the stories of people doing a really good job with a little bit of money. But I think Department of Corrections is definitely an agency that needs to be audited.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
I'm changing the subject. I'd like to know the candidates' positions on opening up the primaries to non-party affiliated voters. I believe Mark has come out in support of that. I'd like to know about the other two candidates.
Should we?
Go ahead. This is Jamie. I do think we have to find a way to engage folks who are non-affiliated and other affiliated, but for the purpose of parties opening up, I think it should be up to the parties. And I think there is a disadvantage to parties for just opening it up, given the percentage. We've got about 40% of folks who are not registered with either party, and parties do have the right to choose candidates that they feel most aligned with the core values of the platform. People, as you all know, can change registrations. It can change a registration temporarily to vote in a primary. And again, I do think that we need to find a system, whether it's allowing folks who are not registered with either party to vote on the full range of candidates, or I think some of those things need to be explored, but just forcing the parties to open up their primaries, I don't think is the appropriate route.
I support open primaries. I think that a lot of the fear around having open primaries is based on a lot of misinformation. You hear these stories every election cycle about, oh my gosh, there's going to be, I think I saw something, I forget which state it was, but in the past 6 months where it was, this effort for all these right-wing people to vote for Bernie Sanders because they believed he'd have a hard time beating Trump. That didn't end up happening. So I think a lot of the fears that we have around closed primaries are based on fears that haven't been realized. There's lots of states that have open primaries, and they still get the Democratic candidate in their primaries that most align with the Democratic Party value. And I think particularly in Oregon, we're unique because of our motor voter, automatic voter registration, where we had this enormous block of people who ideologically are committed to a set of values, whether it's the Democratic or the Republican Party, but they don't even know how to register. My own brother, who he is registered as a non-affiliated, he had to ask me, how do I re-register as a Democrat so I can vote for you in this election? But Jamie is right. We can't do it. We can't go tell them to do it. Under the First Amendment clause of the U.S. Constitution, they have a right under the Free Association Clause to their own. But we can use the same bully pulpit that we use for other issues, right? It's one thing to say, this is something I can't have direct control over. But if you're the Secretary of State in Oregon, you're the Democratic Secretary of State, I think that you can go to the Democratic Party of Oregon and maybe with somebody else go to the Republican Party of Oregon and talk about opening up the primaries. And so using that bully pulpit, not just when you have actual control over a situation, but when you have a unique voice that actually will persuade people. But I think that the end run around the Secretary of State can support through legislation is allowing same-day voter registration. Because what happens a lot in primaries is people get their ballot and they're excited about you. I saw this so many times in 2018 when I was running against Senator Monroe, where people would be so excited and then I'd come to their house and they'd be like, you're not on my ballot. And they'd be so confused. And literally, it didn't even say Democratic or non-affiliated or Republican ballot. It just had a yellow stripe at the top. And that's how people were supposed to know that their ballot was a non-affiliated ballot. Well, that's like code. Who knows that? And yet at that point, it was too late for them to actually change their party registration because the ballots had been mailed out. And so I think that we have to, again, reduce barriers, meet people where they are. And the reality is a lot of voters don't even start paying attention until ballots drop. And by then it's too late. It's often too late to change their party registration. So yeah, I support open primaries, and the Secretary of State can do a lot more than just say hands off. She could go to them with her platform as the Democratic Secretary of State and help assuage those fears that the Democratic Party of Oregon might have.
Another part of the
Mark,
role is educating voters.
Yeah, this is Mark. I just want to say I've been very clear on this since day one on open primaries. Last fall, I formally asked the Democratic Party of Oregon to open their primaries to unaffiliated voters, the largest category of voters in Oregon. And they took that request. In the end, their executive committee voted not to, for this, at least for this cycle. But I made my case, and I was very clear about this. This is one of the very serious flaws we have in our democratic system in this state. And it's just a large conversation that the state needs to have. I think the Secretary of State should lead that conversation next year about how to include these voters, 41%, who have no say in who is nominated for these critical posts.
But this is, guys, both of you, this is a very different urban versus rural issue. So the perspective of rural Democrats is trying to get a voice forward. I mean, the point that of other states, a lot of them have gone to the jungle primary, and that allows that to happen. But there's, the major part of the major job of the Secretary of State is to educate voters and make sure people understand the process and understand what the options are. That's part of the job. And that's why it's both a executive management as well as a having experience with legislation or passing laws. You also need to know how government works and how to engage government in serving the public.
Could I ask each of you to tell me who's the Secretary of State in Oregon's past who you would like to model your tenure as? Who do you look to?
Are we supposed to just jump? Sorry. Normally there's like a order. Should we just jump in, or how
jump in.
Do this? Just jump in.
Well, I would say for me, this is Mark. Bill Bradbury and Phil Kiesling are both helping me. I would take sort of the best of both of what they did. Bill Bradbury was the guy in redistricting 2001 at my first term who got stuck with that difficult issue under lots of pressure and held up to that pressure. And he and I have talked a lot about redistricting on that, and it's helped formulate my opinions. And likewise, I think Phil Kiesling stood up to a lot of pressure in his day there and helped instigate and continue the performance auditing techniques that are so important to that auditing function today.
I would, since Mark, cheated and went with two, I would go with multiple as well. I would say Barbara Roberts, Phil Kiesling, and Kate Brown, all because they did big things during their tenure. Barbara Roberts, which hers wasn't necessarily in the voting realm, but she, the state archives literally was in a carpet warehouse when Barbara Roberts was Secretary of State. And, you think about these documents that are incredibly important to Oregon's history. And so that was something that, at the time, it was a big deal to not have, a carpet warehouse with our most important state documents. I'm a huge fan of history and storytelling. And then, of course, Phil Kiesling, I agree with Mark about, basically championing and implementing vote by mail. And then Kate Brown pushing the idea of automatic voter registration, which was first in the nation. She and I sat down my very first term as a legislator in 2013. I sat down with then Secretary of State Kate Brown, then Representative Ben Unger, and a couple of folks from the Bus Project, and we mapped out our path to passing automatic voter registration in Oregon. And to watch that go from just an idea in 2013 to being law in 2015 was a pretty remarkable feat. And then to have other states across the country, now Republican and Democratic governors signing that into law, I think is really extraordinary.
Yeah, I'll say I'm also going to mention two. One is Kate Brown for two reasons. One, the innovative work she did around motor voter and helping to move that forward. The other is her leadership on a national scale. Last summer, I was talking to California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. He said that Oregon used to be seen as a leader and have a leadership role nationwide. But when Kate stepped into the governor's role, we've gone pretty quiet. And that's something I think we need to change. That's something that I would really advocate for and make sure we have leadership on the national level to move forward on the things where we are leading, and then also to make sure, be an advocate for making the changes we do need to make, whether it's same-day registration, making postmark count. I mean, some of the things that we should have moved forward on, but we haven't, frankly, had some of the leadership in the legislature that we've needed to move forward on. The other person that I think, because this role is not just about, it's different from the legislature in that the aggressive and sometimes even toxic behavior towards colleagues and others is not needed in this role. And so I really appreciate Gene Atkins' approach, being very diplomatic and bringing a real graciousness, real steadiness to the role. I think having someone who has both of those skills to be able to provide the overall leadership statewide and nationwide, provide the outreach and education, be an advocate for the things we need to move forward on, but also have that diplomacy and graciousness is critically important. I really appreciated Mark's comments earlier when he talked about when he first got into politics and the learning curve. And when I was first elected in 2004, I had a similar experience. And the city of Santa Clara, where I was elected, is about 120,000 folks. So it's larger than a state Senate district. And I was in the political minority myself when I first got in. And in that experience, you learn how to do your political homework and how to actually work with your colleagues to get things done, and realize that sometimes you can speak loudly, not by shouting and waving your hands or denigrating your colleagues, but by actually working with them to move important legislation forward and move important policy ideas forward. And so I think that's part of the role that is really important, especially now with this toxic environment we have in Salem. It's critically important to have someone with those skills who can work with folks across the political spectrum, the urban-rural divide, and bring people together around ideas and make sure there's that kind of outreach, and making sure that voices that are not currently feeling heard are heard. This is huge for progressives in rural communities, rural Democrats. But I've been surprised in the time I spent in the Portland metro area, how many people, especially communities of color, are not feeling heard and are incredibly frustrated, are not feeling represented in statewide office. And that's something that I think needs to change. And that's why I've got the support from so many of those quieter voices that are looking to see that change in Salem.
Can we return to the audit question? Because I don't think we did the full round there. Ms. McLeod-Skinner, can you tell us what state agency you would audit first and why, or have audited and why?
Yeah, well, there are a couple key points, and my colleagues have raised them as well. The emergency preparedness, I mean, that's a no-brainer. That's part of my experience as well, working in emergency situations in post-war environments in Bosnia and Kosovo. I was also trained as a city staff and as an elected policymaker in the NIM system, the National Incident Management System. So after we're through this pandemic and this immediate crisis, making sure we do an assessment of what we did well and what we could do better is really important for things that we can anticipate, larger things like the Cascadia event, but also for more regional emergencies that we might face. But I think the big one that it's an unseen crisis that we're facing right now is actually in education, where we're seeing almost a quarter of our educators leave every year. And so there's educators want to talk about things like class size, and there's pushback in the legislature. I think we should be looking at that through a health and safety lens. And it's the health and safety of our educators and our kids to be identifying what the problems are in the classroom and how we can make sure we're creating an environment that supports those who are helping to build the future of our country and of our state. So there's a lot of audits are supposed to daylight the unseen things. And I've talked about a lot of different types of audits. I'm really glad to see the Secretary of State starting to head in this direction. We're looking not just at financial, but also performance audits. Is the money being spent as intended? There's issues there. Equity audits, having that lens to make sure we're addressing the discrepancies between how different communities are being served. We also need to be collecting data so we can actually identify that. Sustainability audits, information security audits, safety audits, using that health and safety lens. My background, I was trained for organizational development. I was trained in the Baldrige model. So you look for strengths and opportunities for improvement. And the rollout here is really important because we've got a lot of folks who are working really hard and doing great work. I know from being frontline staff myself years ago when I was an AFSCME member, you're working really hard and you hear this criticism of government, but we need to be identifying both what's working and what needs to change, what needs to improve. And that's partially that rollout model also of identifying both those. The other things on audits is we need to be looking at subcontractors. So that was one of, when Secretary Richardson talked about focusing on foster kids, he raised a really good point that there were kids who are at risk, and that's that health and safety lens, but he only focused on state agencies and not those subcontractors. And so we need to have a broader perspective. We need to daylight what the issues are. And then the way the Secretary of State can make change effectively, and this is part of the outcome-based management that I was trained on, that I worked in the city of Sunnyvale in helping that city transition to not just counting widgets, but looking at the outcomes you're trying to create or capture. What I would do is, based on the outcome, when we saw systematic problems within state agencies, is develop new key performance measures, KPMs. So essentially the report card that state agencies go before the legislature with every year, and how they're evaluated by the legislature are based on their KPMs. Well, once we identify and daylight some of the issues with some of these different agencies and some of the different problems we're seeing, especially around health and safety, especially around the needs of frontline staff to do their job, we write new KPMs and propose those to the legislature to adopt. Again, we'll need the leadership in the legislature to actually adopt them, but propose those so that every year when that state agency is reporting out to the legislature, they will then be reporting on those new KPMs. And I think that's how we make systematic change over time, to really identify what needs to be changed, what needs to be addressed, and to get to those health and safety issues.
Thank you. Senator Haas, same question to you on which state agency you would prioritize for an audit and why?
The first audit I would order would be a comprehensive audit of the new Student Success Act. I worked on that law for a long time, and it is necessarily complex. On the education side, there's all kinds of different grants and pots of money for which school districts are now applying. And it's complicated and complex because, for example, the graduation in this state as an average has historically been lower than average. But the graduation rate in West Lynn is 99%. In Astoria, it's 60%. So we couldn't just pass one bill and say, here's the one answer to everybody's problem here. And so that's why there are all kinds of different avenues that give local school districts all kinds of different options. And I want to make sure that money and all of those options are being directed to the right place, and that money is getting into the classroom or where it's supposed to be, and not getting hijacked by the legislature or by the bureaucracy. And that's on the education side. On the tax side, of course, this corporate activity tax is also very complex, as all taxes are. And I want to make sure, essentially, that it's being paid by those who are in the queue to pay it, and it's not being gamed. And already the tax has been in effect for just a few months, and I can already see the beginnings of that as these corporations are hiring law firms and consultants to help them with it. So I want to make sure that both ends of that fairly historic law are being intended and being followed, and it's not anything punitive. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page.
So given our current economic situation, is that law actually going to have its intended impact? Do you support, there's a push to repeal the corporate activities tax. Where do you stand on that? Are there, other tax repeals or even passing new taxes that you want to support around the issue of education? Senator Haas?
Well, the Student Success Act is state law. We were able to work with business interests and convince them not to refer it to a ballot, which was a huge success as far as I was concerned, because we didn't have to go through this contentious, divisive ballot measure in January. So it's in state law. The first payments are due in the first quarter. The tax went into effect in January. And as far as making any changes to it, I don't foresee any major changes. I think maybe there are some things we can do to better protect small businesses temporarily through the end of this year, maybe, or maybe try and stall off some layoffs by making the deduction for labor a little richer than they are. But I don't think that I can tell you that I don't support any kind of repeal or delay. That's for sure.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end. Sorry to keep you longer than expected because of our tech problems. I wanted to keep us going a little longer. I want to ask each of you to ask your opponents a question. You get to choose which opponent. I would ask that it be a substantive, serious question. Senator Haas, why don't we start with you asking a colleague or an opponent a question?
Sure. I guess I would start with Senator Fagan because I heard her say earlier restoring faith in democracy, and I was surprised. Last year, the Oregonian did a series called Polluted by Money about campaign contributions and campaign spending. And in that story, Senator, you were called out as one of the legislators who do this practice of double dipping, in which you're being paid a per diem from the state to attend the legislature, but then you're also using campaign finances to pay for lodging and restaurants and that sort of thing. And as the news story noted, that's not technically illegal, but it's unethical. And I just wonder how you account for that, especially if you're running for an office in which you're overseeing elections and campaigns.
Well, thank you for pointing out that there's nothing illegal about it. And a lot of us I'm the primary breadwinner in my family. And when I go serve in the legislature, I have to take a leave of absence from my job as an attorney. And so the per diem amount that we get when we're in session, for a lot of us, helps pay our mortgage. If you look at the statute on the per diem, it's not limited to, it's not like you don't go get a hotel room and then seek reimbursement from the state. Everybody gets that money. And most nights I live in my house in Happy Valley, or at the time, I stayed down in Salem about one night a week because I have a 7 p.m. Capital Culture Committee in the evenings. And so, yeah, I used, which is a common practice. If we need to change that law, I would be fine looking at that. But we have severely underpaid legislatures who make $20,000 a year. And for some of us who have other jobs that support our families, when we're in session, it essentially is me living on $20,000 a year, and yet you get that per diem that I use to be able to not actually to basically take a leave of absence from my job and to pay for to pay for gas, to pay for things to get down to Salem. So yeah, it's definitely not I've followed the law every time. And, if folks want to change the law on that, I would continue to follow the law. But we have a severely underpaid legislature, in part because we dictate our own salary, and we get paid $22,000 a year. And if we continue to make that unaffordable for people to do, you will have less young people, less working parents, less people of color, less people without independent wealth or with wealthy spouses to be able to, or retired people to do that job, because otherwise you can't afford to do it. Because when we're in session, I really can't work as an attorney.
Yes, but subsidizing your lifestyle and your livelihood through campaign funding is borderline illegal and is definitely unethical. And I don't think you've answered the question, how are people supposed to trust you if you're going to be the person running for this seat overseeing elections and campaigns?
I don't subsidize my lifestyle. I've never paid my mortgage. I've never paid groceries with campaign funds. When I would stay down in Salem for legislative work, because I had an evening committee that ended late at night, and then I had an early morning judiciary committee the next morning to my legislative work. I would pay for a hotel room in Salem with my campaign contributions. I have never supplemented my lifestyle in my family or paid for my family. I was paying for legislative work, which is very common for people to pay for legislative work to, whether it's staff or to supplement office budgets with buying, I had to buy a computer for my legislative office, for example, with PAC funds, because the software that we wanted to use to be able to do really informative videos for people, the legislative computers don't allow you to put that software on there. So I used campaign funds to buy a computer that was used entirely by a taxpayer funded staffer because the state didn't allow me to put the software on that we could help create videos to help Oregonians. So don't put words in my mouth. Supplement it with my lifestyle.
Ms. Fagan, if I can interrupt, I think what Mark is saying is what you did is legal. He just thinks it's a bad look. Would you agree that it's a bad look?
I don't think it's a bad look. I think the reality is we underpay legislators, and the amount of money that you get as a per diem is taxable income to you as a person. It's not reimbursement for hotel rooms. It's not reimbursement for meals. It is taxable income to you on your taxes. You pay personal income taxes on that money. And so I take a look.
Can you tell us what your annual income will be as a lawyer?
What it will be? What do you mean?
Sure, what it will be in 2020.
Well, I hopefully will not be a lawyer in 2020. I will hopefully be.
Okay. What was it in
2020? I'm sorry, 2021. In 2020, I run my own law practice, and so it's been extremely low. So I think my annual income as an attorney is probably going to be in the $40,000 range. I don't know for sure. I'm a contingency fee attorney, so I don't want to. If I make more or less than that by the end of the year, I'm not trying to be dishonest. It's just, if I win a case, we get paid. If I don't win a case, we don't get paid. So it's a contingency fee law practice. So I can't give you an exact amount.
Understood.
Ms. McLeod Skinner, do you want to ask one of your opponents a question?
Sure. And just to touch base, I got a text from one of my colleagues. There was an earlier question about the largest contribution. There's a guy who lives in Bend called Pete Sanger, and he's retired and he volunteers at a homeless shelter. He gave $2,550 in the cycle. He also gave in the previous cycle. So it's funny. This is maybe just a small thing, but in terms of a question, but Shami, I've heard you mention recently the secret caucus votes and how horrible they are in the state Senate. And so the thing I've been actually meaning to ask you this anyway is just because you've been through 2 sessions without mentioning them, the secret caucus votes. Why are you talking about it now? Why haven't you changed it? And what the Secretary of State wouldn't do that. That's something you'd have to do from inside the Senate. So why is that tied into the Secretary of State's role? Why haven't you changed it, I guess, is really the question.
The Secretary of State is the overseer of public records and administers public records laws. And there is a public records exemption for caucus conversations. And I spoke out about this at my caucus retreat in November of 2018. Before I was ever even sworn in, I said I found the practice appalling and did what I knew to do at the time before I knew more information about it, which is at the beginning, at the bottom of every vote slip. So there is just to kind of give the reporters in the caucus meeting, they take this public records exemption to the extreme by literally casting a secret ballot inside caucus meetings. So the majority leader literally hands out a slip and it has the bill number, you put your name and it has a yes or a no and a comment. And you vote and you close that slip, and then those votes get passed to the front of the room, and only one person in the caucus gets to count that vote. So you have lots of people, journalists, activists saying, hey, why didn't this bill pass? And you get that tedious, because we didn't have the votes. Well, who was a no vote? Well, we can't tell you. And so I was appalled by this practice. I believe that public officials doing public work should do their business in public. And so I used to write at the bottom of all my caucus slips, please share freely with anyone who asks. To the point where Jenny Burdick came to me and said, I get it. You don't need to write that anymore. I said, I don't believe this should be a secret vote. I think this is a subversion of our democracy to have people taking public positions during campaigns and then going into the legislature and telling people, sure, I'll be a yes if it ever gets to the floor, knowing full well they will then prevent it from getting to the floor by this secret caucus vote. And so I immediately spoke out against it. I immediately started writing, please share freely with anyone who asks. And I believe it's an issue for the Secretary of State because she's the overseer of public records. And now it's my turn to ask a question. And that's actually.
But wait, you haven't really, this is the point is you, I mean, it was you presented it well, and that's why I've heard you present it that way before. But the question becomes why. There's things that you, and this is true of Mark too, are talking about with regard to the Secretary of State that are legislative changes or the things that would need to change within the legislature. And the fact that you haven't changed it in that role, but are talking about being in a different role is the essence of the question. I mean, why haven't you caused change? If you talk about being effective and being able to make change and make change in the legislature, then why haven't you changed that?
So if the question is, why as legislators hasn't everything changed exactly? Because we get a limited number of bills. Let me give you a quick rundown, Ms. McLeod-Skinner, since you're curious. In 2013, I was the chief co-sponsor of a bill to create the Small Business Advocate.
Shmi, I'm not opening this up. I'm not opening this up for your.
You asked me a question.
No. This is
not the work that I did as a representative or in relation to the Secretary of State's office. I helped.
This is the thing. I'm going on the grandstanding.
I helped pass. I'm not grandstanding. You asked me a question about my legislature.
That's not the question. That's not the question.
It is the question. Yes, I've been doing lots of work relating to the Secretary of State's office. Most recently, prepaid postage, and Mark wasn't even.
Not the question, Shamia. Not the question.
I'm gonna cut in here just because we're short for time. Senator Fagan, can you ask one of your opponents a question? And then we're gonna do, just so you all have a preview, we're gonna do a wrap up after that. Give you 2 minutes each maybe to answer the question of why we should endorse you. And then we'll have, as is traditional, our at least fun for us question.
Okay. So Mark, I have a question for you. Oh, I'm sorry, Rachel, go ahead. So Mark, I have a question for you, and it's actually around this. As you know, I proposed closing the public records loophole that allows our caucus to vote in secret and to prevent legislation from going to the floor. Most recently, as we all know, it was used to kill the Clean Energy Jobs Bill in the 2019 session, where President Cordy went to the floor and simply announced the bill is dead. We don't have the votes, and yet nobody was allowed to know who the no votes were. People had to go do sleuthing and researching, when the reality is we're public officials doing public work. Do you also support closing the loophole that allows our caucus to do secret vote slips?
Well, I knew who those legislators were. I don't know how you didn't find out. I don't know. I don't think that was a. So there's been whips and whipping in Congress and every legislature around the country since time immemorial. It's how legislative bodies, not just in legislators in Congress, but in city councils, manage. And I'm sorry you don't like that process. Maybe you shouldn't attend caucuses, or you should have spoken up earlier. You've been in the legislature for a while, and I haven't heard this from you until you started for the seat. So I didn't find anything secret about the incident you mentioned, and so my problem with caucuses is there's too many. And we went through this, I think, 15 years ago. The Senate Democratic Caucus, I was in the House, opened to the press after a hullabaloo that was raised in the press, and finally the Senate Ds said, okay, fine, come cover us. And what happened was it all fizzled, because the press and the public found out how truly boring caucuses were. And there wasn't anything diabolically being planned. And if there was anything being planned that was diabolic, then it was often driven into smaller offices. And so that's what happened to that experiment. And pretty soon the press just lost interest. And so here we are today. But there was nothing secretive about the incident you mentioned. And so I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Well, if I could follow up, that this is a practice that wasn't happening in the House. And Mark maybe wasn't paying attention, but I brought it up in November of 2018 at the caucus retreat, which is the first time I ever learned about this secret ballot process. And it's different than whip counting. It's not just people having conversations and counting votes. It's literally a piece of paper that is a vote, that we literally vote, and nobody else in the caucus And yeah, people speculated on who the no votes were, but it wasn't a public vote that people actually got to hold people accountable for. So are you not remembering that we passed vote slips out for just about every single bill we vote on? And that's not how it was done in the House. I didn't know it was a practice until I joined the Senate Democratic Caucus. So just to be clear, you don't support any changes to that public records exemption?
I don't believe those are public records. I think what's the difference between writing something down on a piece of paper and having a whip come over during the floor and saying, hey, how are you going to vote on this bill? And then the whip goes back and reports what they can. Whips have been doing that for years.
But
as a whip myself, I can tell you.
It's well known that legislation constantly passes the House and dies in the Senate without a vote. Legislation important to Oregon because they don't even get a vote because nobody lets it go to the floor because of these vote slips. So I hear your answer. You don't want any changes.
Senator Haas.
Well, you're not being truthful, Shamia. So bills that pass in the House don't die in the Senate. You just said bills pass in the House and they die in the Senate. Do you remember the Student Success Act? That passed. Do you remember clean diesel?
There are a litany of bills that have been graveyarded in the Senate because they never even got a vote. National popular vote was one of them, passed the House multiple times. I got in the Senate and I asked Peter Courtney, please put this on the floor, even if we don't have 16 votes in our vote slips. And you know what? We passed that bill with Republican support with Peter Courtney and Jenny Burdick and Betsy Johnson all voting no, because I was part of the group of legislators that asked him to put that on the floor regardless of not having 16 votes in caucus. And it took leadership like that because it had previously never even gotten a vote. So there's lots of bills that have died in the Senate from never getting a vote.
So Senator Haas, you said it was public information. Which senators had opposed the climate bill? Who were they?
Senators Roebland, Johnson, and Monis Anderson.
Okay. Do you want to start? I'm gonna shrink us down. Can you take 1 minute, Senator Haas, to explain why Willamette Week should endorse you for Secretary of State?
Well, I think these times, as I mentioned earlier, put an exclamation point on why we need people who have experience, who have been tested. And I've been tested in that building for almost 20 years, and I've got some big bills through, and I've lost some big bills. Today, I came out with what I would do in my first 90 days as Secretary of State. It's in a newsletter today. And I'm drawing on my experience and my work with others on my first priorities. It include mostly an Office of Election Cybersecurity that would protect voters from misinformation, auditing the Student Success Act, having a new audits protocol that allows audits to be analyzed for climate change mitigation, revamping our public records advocate process, ranked choice voting. I think the Secretary of State should set up an office to allow more counties to do that and facilitate them. I was outspoken proponent of open primaries, as we talked about earlier. I would set up a child protection ombudsman inside the Secretary of State's office, and I would audit addiction recovery services since we have such a coordinated recovery system there. So I was the first one out with these kinds of policies. I'm mystified by why I seem to be the only one that has these kinds of policies and proposals, but that's what was very important to me from the day I started. And I think I've been tested enough and been qualified enough to run for the seat, and I have the independence to do this job, and I have the integrity to do it right.
Thank you. Ms. McLeod-Skinner.
Sure. I will agree that experience is very important for this role, and that's experience both as a policymaker, but also understanding how government actually works. If you're going to be conducting audits and looking at how resources are allocated, you actually have to have looked under the hood before. You've got to be a mechanic. You can't just be a race car driver. And so those dual experiences are critically important because the Secretary of State is essentially an executive management position. They're policy, they're leadership roles, but you've got to be able to bring all voices to the table and be able to manage those really critical divisions that serve all Oregonians. I think being able to bridge the urban-rural divide and also the political divide is critically important. Contributing to the toxic culture that's in the Capitol right now should be a disqualifier. The breakdown has been in large part a failure to do political homework. a failure to reach out and build those bridges across the state. Election security and integrity are both important. Mark touched on some really key election security issues, and I've got this information on my website. But election integrity is also important, making sure voices that are not currently heard are heard, bringing more people into the process. I would establish metrics for myself and my team, both to increase voter turnout overall, and then also collect data and decrease the discrepancies between the different demographics in terms of voter turnout. And then the solutions of making information available in more languages, finding out how to do the outreach, talking to folks and working with community-based organizations is really the way to do that. The accountable government piece is critically important. So making sure that's also rebuilding public trust. So transparency, accountability, all those are key issues, key factors. But through the audit process, we should be looking at a range of different agencies. Also, state agencies are already required to audit themselves. So developing those resources and that expectation also of their subcontractors, but looking at audits beyond just financial audits to performance audits, equity audits, sustainability audits, health and safety audits, and information security audits as well. The rollout also should not just be a gotcha by press release, but in partnership with the agencies. So the focus is on what's working and what we need to be doing differently, and how can we be improving government, and again, building public trust. Sustainability of our resources is also really important, and that's so that the State Land Board managing or overseeing the state lands and public waterways is important, but making sure we have a sustainable approach to our natural resources is really critical for the ag and forestry industry. So things like the climate bill should not have failed, but the advocates should be, that's where the political homework failed. It was not done because the greatest advocates are really in rural Oregon for that. And then one of the other roles that we haven't talked about in terms of another agency is the registration of businesses. Now that's usually seen, it doesn't get as much attention, but with the tremendous impact on our economy from COVID-19, really buttressing and working closely with businesses throughout Oregon, especially small businesses, and finding ways to build partnerships and strengthen and provide more resources and advocacy is going to be really important for our rebounding from COVID-19. So there's obviously the health and crisis, that experience and that management that's taking place right now, the analysis and review and auditing of it afterwards, but also making sure we're setting the stage so that Oregon is a national leader. Everything from the work we're doing on our elections, there's also some steps that need to be taken. We need more leadership in the legislature to get that legislation passed, and the ones we mentioned before, but also providing a national role, national leadership in those areas. I have relationships not just throughout the state, but regionally and even nationally and internationally, and that's something that's important. One other aspect that is key to this role we haven't talked about, and let me just finish on this, is that
let's make this your last point, please.
That's fine. Is the lieutenant governor role. And something that's not typically talked about the lieutenant governor is the fact that she also deploys our troops, our National Guard troops. And we know from current situations that can mean to places of war. And so actually having the experience of working in a post-war environment, having that experience of working with our troops to secure the peace is something that is an important part of this role as well.
Thank you. Senator Fagan.
Well, thank you for the lively discussion, both from my colleagues and from the folks in the press doing your job and pushing us. So I appreciate that. This is a job that some see maybe as an agency head and others see as a visionary leader. And I think right now we're seeing the difference of that, unfortunately, in Secretary of State Bev Clarno. Just yesterday, we were on a call with her, and I asked her, we have the President of the United States out calling Oregon elections corrupt and cheating. What are you doing about that? And her response was, I put out a press release or a statement. So I literally went on the Secretary of State's website last night, went on the media page, went on the newsroom page. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying I couldn't find it, was searching around. We literally have a president saying that our very way of doing democracy for the past 20 years is corrupt, and zero leadership coming out of the Secretary of State's office because maybe she sees herself as just running an agency. Steve Trout talked about the fact that he's on calls with other states, which is great, but we're seeing no leadership that I can see from the Secretary of State right now when our very way of democracy is under attack. And so I think this is a job where we need somebody who knows how to effectively use a bully pulpit. And that's something that I have been in the legislature since 2013. 2014. And it has been a remarkably successful time in the legislature for somebody who was in my early 30s when I started. As I mentioned, in my first term, I was the chief co-sponsor of the bill to create the Office of Small Business Assistance. That is now an international leader in assisting small businesses right here in Oregon. I also sponsored the bill to create benefit corporations in Oregon. In my next session, I aided then Secretary of State Kate Brown in passing automatic voter registration. I finally helped lead the movement to pass national popular vote in Oregon, which if the compact is ever actually activated, the Secretary of State in Oregon would have a huge role in implementing that. I actually was forward thinking, and in 2019 introduced the conversation of lowering Oregon's voting age, which was an incredibly remarkable conversation with our 16 and 17-year-olds. And regardless of whether people agree or disagree with that, it was amazing to see these kids who are out there fighting for climate change and gun violence prevention and housing and college affordability actually see that maybe they could get involved. And even if it's only until they're 18, to get them involved early was remarkable. In House Bill 2983, I sponsored the bill to expose dark money in our elections and make these nonprofit corporations that are coming in our elections be exposed. And finally, I was a sponsor of the bill, the only one here who was a sponsor of that dark money bill, and the only one who was a sponsor of Senate Bill 861 to put paid postage on all ballots, which looks really, really prescient right now, as we're not going to have to send Oregonians to the store to buy stamps. And so I have been leading on issues relating to the Secretary of State's office since the day I walked into the Capitol in 2013. And now I'm looking forward to taking that same leadership statewide as we, yes, build a legislative package, just like all statewide leaders do, but then effectively use that bully pulpit. As somebody from rural Oregon, I really appreciate that Jamie is as well. I grew up in Duffer and the Dalles. My mom, when she passed away, was living in Umatilla. My brother's a diesel mechanic in Stanfield. My other brother's a sheet metal worker in Pendleton. So Eastern Oregon perspectives are incredibly important to me, those that are outside the metro area in Eastern and Central and Southern Oregon, the rural perspective. And so I bring that to the table. And so I am the only candidate in this race who has actually won competitive races in Oregon, having won twice in a House district that was more competitive than the state of Oregon is statewide in 2012 and 2014. And so if Democrats in Oregon support me in this primary, then we've got a sure winner in the November election.
Okay, so now for the fun. We'll start with you, Senator Fagan. What's one unusual thing you've done during this period of quarantine that you'll remember for the rest of your life?
Not only remember, but I'm going to keep doing it. My best friend since high school, Emmy Lou Taylor, we met in 1994 during basketball camp in the Dallas High School. She lives in New York now, and she's in the scary part of New York, like seriously, quarantine. And we love to play Trivial Pursuit. I have every version of Trivial Pursuit. I love that game. And we started playing weekly over Zoom. And first off, I'm like, why have we not already done this? Like, you've lived in New York, I've lived in Oregon. So we started these weekly Trivial Pursuit games over Zoom and having an absolute blast. And there's now a version out that is up to and including 2016, which I don't have yet, but it is sold out on Amazon. So I think there are a lot of other people also playing the new version of Trivial Pursuit.
Did someone ask which version of Trivial Pursuit? Anyway, Senator Haas, do you want to, what's your answer to that? What's one unusual thing you've done during this period of quarantine that you'll remember forever?
Well, I don't know how unusual it is, but like a lot of folks, going to the gym was kind of a regular ritual for me early in the morning. And of course, gyms are closed. And so I started going running early in the morning, like 6:37, and it's cold. And I'd forgotten how cold and wet it can be in these early days. But it just sort of reawakened and is reinvigorating. And but that's not it. It's my 12-year-old started going out with me, and we started off with 3/4 of a mile, walking some, and now we're up to 2 miles. And he's not in track this year because of all these reasons. And so there's a really good thing going on with us. And, you look for all kinds of reasons why these terrible things happen. But there are silver linings throughout. And that is one that I would count as a silver lining.
Hey, Mark, does he still have his cast on his arm, or is that off now?
It's off.
Got it.
Thank you. Ms. McLeod-Skinner.
I think it's a combination of the two. first, I have to admit, I'm really enjoying having all the extra time with my wife. We're usually both traveling around so much. That's been a real joy. But what similar to Shamia is that my wife's grandma lives in an assisted living center down in Medford, and we usually when we visit with the kids, we play this game called Marbles. It's this little board game, and we're still working on the best way to get it to work remotely, so we can get through Zoom, get many members of the family playing this game. But it's something that that we always, it's a real delight. And she's this very sweet little old lady who becomes just a real what's the gentle word to say this? She becomes very assertive, shall we say, when it comes to marbles games. But it's a really fun. The family enjoys it very much. So we're working on doing that remotely, so we can be bringing folks together and still keeping that family connection.
Thank you all, and thank you all for sticking in longer than expected. And we will be in touch. You'll see the endorsement issue at the end of the month.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.